Hello, everyone. As promised, I'm back today to talk about slavery. And the thing with a lot of like slavery discourse in the United States and the Americas in general is that it focuses heavily on the trauma that Black people endured, and it focuses so little on the resistance. And I ask myself, like, why is that? Well, the simple answer is that the people who develop educational curriculums, people like DeSantis and the people that he's paying to fuck up Florida's educational system, basically brainwash people into white supremacists. They don't want people learning that we resisted, and in many cases successfully resisted. It was the same back when the resistance was going on. Like if there was a slave revolt, they did not want Africans finding out about it because we would emulate it. That was part of why black people were literally forbidden to read. Like, yeah, they would literally beat the fuck out of you or even kill you if they found you reading, because reading and knowledge of what was going on in the world was dangerous. And it's why a lot of black people in the United States and in the Americas in general don't like Christianity, because the Christianity that was taught to us was a fascist type of Christianity. It was a slave's Christianity. It was a Christianity that taught us to obey thy master lest to be beaten with many stripes. That type of thing. So submission and obedience, that was the name of the game in the slavery era. Slavery still exists, by the way. One of the Reconstruction era amendments of the Constitution says that if you are imprisoned, you could be basically subjected to forced servitude, work that you do not want to do. Granted, they pay you, but it's pennies, okay? Pennies. Like literal pennies. I'm not being hyperbolic here. Like they literally pay you nothing to work in prison. So that's a form of slavery. So what like triggered this discussion? People were going back and forth about it over Twitter last week. You've got this guy that's running for president, this fascist, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, and he's attracted a lot of heat to himself by suggesting that slavery helped us develop skills such as being a blacksmith. Thank you for the follow, People's War. So the Washington Post says that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is intensifying his efforts to de-emphasize racism in his state's public school curriculum by arguing that some black people benefited from being enslaved and defending his state's new African American history standards that civil rights leaders and scholars say misrepresent centuries of U.S. reality. So we're going to come back to this later, um, because this has a history. Like this isn't just something DeSantis pulled out of his ass. This has a history that goes all the way back to the end of the United States Civil War. It's a myth called the Lost Cause. We're going to talk about the Lost Cause later, but right now we're talking about DeSantis. So, this is the type of shit that DeSantis is drawing heat from everybody, including black Republicans. Like, if black Republicans are pissed at you, you're fucking up. You're saying some stupid shit. So, DeSantis says that they're probably going to show, meaning the standards that he's forcing through the Florida educational system, they're probably going to show that some of the folks that eventually parlayed, being a blacksmith into doing things later in life. Like, okay, like what are you talking about? What things? Well, what do you mean doing things? Okay, Africans were blacksmiths when DeSantis's Italian ancestors were still doing Italian things. So we know how to work fucking iron. We do not need slavery being ripped from our homeland and subjected to every type of torture devisable by human fuckery to teach us how to work iron and steel, bruh. And like I said, he's running for president. He's not doing so well against Trump, but like DeSantis, this shit is dangerous because DeSantis has, first of all, military experience. He was a torturer at Guantanamo Bay. He also like has experience running a state, which is a country in miniature. So this guy's a fucking fascist dictator, and if he's elected president, yeah, we're gonna see some shit. We saw some shit under Trump. We've seen some shit pretty much every week for the past 10, 15 years, but we're gonna see some shitty shit. So, Enough about this guy. Just talking about him pisses me off. So, did slavery benefit black people? Like, who did slavery benefit? The answer is obvious, okay? It benefited white people. This is J. Sakai Settlers. I recommended. The book is a meme on the left. Like, you either love it or you hate it. Like, the reaction to this book is it's just hilarious. So, Karl Marx observed, cause slavery to disappear and you will have wiped America off the map of nations. DeSantis is not going to teach us because Sakai is a communist. And DeSantis obviously is not going to teach communism. He's literally told communists not to even bother coming to Florida. What he's going to do with those that are already there is beyond me. Probably horrible things. But yeah, Marx said, cause slavery to disappear and you will have wiped America off the map of nations. Marx was writing during the zenith, the peak of the cotton economy of the mid 1800s, but the most basic fact is true from the bare beginnings of European settlement in America. Without slave labor, there would have been no America. I repeat, without slave labor, there would have been no America. So if you have something without which your country cannot exist, that is what we Maoists, what we leftists, what we communists call the primary contradiction. The thing around which everything else turns, okay? The presence of black people in this country and the shit that we've faced and the fact that we've built this country, that's the primary contradiction. Remove black people from this country and the country will fall apart because it was built off our backs on stolen indigenous land. Indigenous people were actually the first enslaved in the Americas, by the way. When Columbus got here and the people that came immediately after Columbus, they found all of these resources that they could extract. Were the conquistadors going to dig into the rich earth with plows and mines and picks? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. These people came here to get rich, not to work. That's what people keep like missing the point on. These people came here to get rich. They did not come here to work because they knew instinctively that work does not make you rich. Other people's work makes you rich. So they immediately enslaved the indigenous people who started dropping and dying like flies or running off to where they had originally come from. That's the thing. You cannot enslave somebody on their own land and you're a foreigner. It's not going to work because they know the land. You don't. They're going to wage guerrilla war against you and fuck you up. So, um, without slave labor, there would have been no America. It is as simple as that. Long before the cotton economy of the South flourished, for example, African slaves literally built the city of New York. African slaves literally built the city of New York. Hmm. So, by rights, I can build a new African New York and city skylines because we built it. So, I'm just continuing in the footsteps of my ancestors. The work of the African slaves in the city of New York enabled the original Dutch settlers to be fed and sheltered while pursuing their drinking, gambling, fur trading, and other non laboring activities. I like how Sakai says that, like, these settlers were unproductive. They did nothing but come here and look for ways to get rich quickly. Early America was basically a giant get rich quick scheme, okay? And like I said, these settlers knew that you do not get rich through work, through the sweat of your own brows, even though that's what their Bible says. You get rich through fucking people over, through exploiting people. And they had centuries of experience with exploitation in their own countries, okay? Like Britain practiced colonialism on Ireland before they even shuffled into those little carracks that they used or their sloops, their galleons, and came to the African coast or to the Americas. Okay, they practiced on their own people. Africans were not only much of early New York's farmers, carpenters, and blacksmiths, but also comprised much of the city's guards. So DeSantis is talking about how, oh, we taught them how to be blacksmiths. DeSantis' Italian ancestors didn't own any slaves. But regardless, he's saying that white people taught us how to be blacksmiths, carpenters, all of these things. And like, okay, so you're an enslaved African from the Congo in the city of New York in 1692. Okay? You're a carpenter. You're going to be a slave for your entire life because the Dutch, the Brits, the French, they were not in the habit of like just freeing people out of the goodness of their hearts. Your kids are going to be slaves. Like, how exactly does that benefit you? Like, as a human being, as an individual, the only way that the skills that you learned in Africa, not on the plantation, would benefit you would be if you were freed or you made yourself free. And even then, like, were white people in the habit of hiring black people, free black labor? Like, no. That the early unions in this country were exclusionary. They didn't let black people join. So, like, you were fucked. The Dutch settlers were so dependent on African labor for the basics of life that their governor finally had to grant some African slaves both freedom and land in return for the continued food production. That is funny as fuck. So, you import black people, okay? You are so stupid that you import more of these people than there are numbers of Dutch people, or British people, or French people, or Portuguese, or Spaniards. You import millions of these people, surround yourselves with them, make them do everything for you while you do nothing. These people have no reason not to slit your fucking throat in the middle of the night. Like, again, antagonistic contradiction. Why the fuck would you import millions of hostile people? Like, what white America did, what would become white America did, was basically import its own fifth column, because a slave has nothing in common with the slave owner. Now, when you read slave narratives, you'll hear them talking about how they saved massive gold from the Yankees. Okay, these people were brainwashed. But a real true blue field Negro, as Malcolm X would say, would just as much cut your throat as save you from anything. Malcolm X said that when a fucking strong wind came and the master's house was on fire, the field slave would pray for a strong wind. When the master got sick, the field slave, the majority of slaves, the masses, the proletariat would pray for master to die. The house slave, the privileged class, I guess the slave labor aristocracy, if you will, they busted their ass trying to save massa because they affiliated, they assigned themselves the status of massa over other slaves. They thought they were better than the other slaves. So you've already got this proto class distinction among slaves. Anyways, um, so and another thing that people will say is that, oh, my ancestors never had slaves, but still you benefited. Sakai says, thus, the early settlers were not just the passive beneficiaries of a far off African slave trade. They bankrolled their settlements in part with the profits of their own eager explorations into native slave trading. So you didn't have to own a plantation to dabble in the slave trade. You could be a trader, you could buy and sell people. What's up, Full Metal Maoist? The essence is not the individual ownership of slaves, but rather the fact that the world capitalism in general, and Euro American capitalism in specific, had forged a slave based economy in which all settlers gained and took part. So, all sections of white settler society, even the artisan, worker, and farmer, were totally dependent upon African slave labor. Totally dependent, not part way, not somehow, like all of the fucking way depended on black people. If black people were not here, because we already explained why they couldn't enslave the indigenous people, they would have nothing. They would have been driven back into the sea. So all sections of white settler society, even the artisan, worker, and farmer, were totally dependent upon African slave labor. The fishermen, whose low grade refuge fish was dried and sold as slave meal in the Indies. The New York farmer who found his market for surpluses in the southern plantations. The forester whose timber was used by shipyard workers rapidly turning out slave ships. The clerk in the New York City export house checking bales of tobacco awaiting shipment for London. The master cooper in the Boston rum distillery. The young Virginia overseer building up his stake to try and start his own plantation. A lot of Irish actually did that. Like, they would come here, they would work as overseers, extremely brutal men. And once they had got enough money or stolen enough money from their employer, they would start their own plantation. The immigrant German farmer renting a team of 5 slaves to get his farm started, and so on and so on. While the cream of the profits went to the planter and merchant capitalists, the entire settler economy was raised up on a foundation of slave labor, slave products, and the slave trade. By the time of the settlers' War of Independence, the African nation made up over 20% of the non Indian population, one African colonial subject for every four settlers. African slaves, although heavily concentrated in the plantation colonies, were still represented throughout the settler territories. Their proportion in the non Indian population ranged from 2 to 3% in Upper New England to 8% in Rhode Island to 14% in New York and to 41% and 60%, a majority, in Virginia and South Carolina. In Virginia, it appears that an overwhelming majority of the skilled workers, carpenters, people who drove boats, they had a habit of running away. Why the fuck would you put a slave in a boat? Why the fuck would you teach them or let them learn how to navigate the waterways? That's just like today, if slavery still existed today. Yeah, I'm just gonna give my slave a fucking Mitsubishi. Let him drive off. Like, bruh. Like these people were like these white people were like fucking babies, bruh. Why would you do that? And then act surprised and run to the newspaper when your slave runs away. They don't want to be fucking slaves. Like that's the thing. Like imagine somebody went to Scotland or Ireland or England and put you in a slave ship, which the Barbary pirates had a habit of doing that. Put you in a slave ship, took you to Algeria, and was like, okay, you're going to we're gonna chain you into this galley and we're gonna make you row. Like that shit actually happened. You remember those old movies where they had all the people in the bottom of the boat and they were all shackled and chained together and they had them rowing and shit. Like that shit actually happened. They would do that. They would put you in the bottom of a boat and make you row if you had gotten into too much debt, if you had did something that you weren't supposed to have done, which back then was a lot of things, and make you do all sorts of other stuff. The Ottoman Turks, they're Janissaries. Like they had white slaves and they had black slaves. The white slaves were usually Balkan, so Serbian, Greek, etc. But they had a habit of making white slaves that they had gotten into either concubines, putting them in the Sultan's harem, or making soldiers out of them. That's what the Janissaries were. So in Virginia, it appears that an overwhelming majority of the skilled workers, carpenters, ship pilots, coopers, blacksmiths, etc., were Africans. Nor was it just non-market production for direct use on the plantation. African artisans produced for the commercial market and were often hired out by their masters. For example, we know that George Washington was not only a planter, but what we would today be called a contractor, building structures for other planters with his gang of African slave carpenters. The profits were split between the father of our country and his slave overseers. The African presence in commerce and industry was widespread and all pervasive, as one labor historian has summarized. Some of the Africans who were brought to America in chains were skilled in wood carving, weaving, construction, and the crafts. In the South, black slaves were not only field hands, many developed a variety of skills. Yeah, because if I recall correctly, it's against it's haram to enslave other Muslims. Anyways, were not only field hands, many developed a variety of skills, or already had a variety of skills that were needed on a nearly self-sufficient plantation. Because skilled labor of whatever color was in great demand, slaves were often hired out to masters who owned shops by the day, month, or year for a stipulated amount. Some were hired out to shipmasters serving as pilots and managers of ferries. Others were used in the maritime trades as ship caulkers, longshoremen, and sailmakers. A large number of slaves were employed in northern cities as house servants, sailors, sailmakers, and carpenters. New York had a higher proportion of skilled slaves than any other colony: coopers, tailors, bakers, tanners, goldsmiths, cabinet makers, shoemakers, and glaziers. Both in Charleston and in the northern cities, many artisans utilized slave labor extensively. So, like, why was all of this happening? Why did they rely on slaves for everything? Well, Sakai explains. This African colony supported on its shoulders the building of a Euro-American society more prosperous, more egalitarian, and yes, more democratic than any in semi-feudal old Europe. The Jeffersonian, Thomas Jefferson, The Jeffersonian vision of America as a pastoral American democracy was rooted in the national life of small, independent white landowners. Such a society had no place of a proletariat. What is the Marxist definition of proletariat? I will tell you the Marxist definition of proletariat. A proletariat is not a small farmer. A proletariat is not a small business owner. It's right there in the manifesto. Proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. Who wears chains in America? Slaves. So the argument can be made, the correct argument can be made, that slaves were the original, the OG proletariat of this country. Yes? Yes. Such a society had no place of a proletariat within its ranks because if the idea is that everybody has 50 or 60 or 70 acres of stolen indigenous land, like, why, for what purpose would you need a proletariat? Everybody has land. Everybody can take care of their own needs, so they think. So black people do all of the work, all of the proletarian work. Hola, compañero. Yet in the age of capitalism, Jeffersonian America could not do without proletarian labor. Somebody had to pick the cotton, tobacco, rice. Somebody had to plant all of that stuff. Somebody had to do the grunt work. Okay? W.B. Du Bois talks about in Black Reconstruction how white people got offended when they had to do field labor. They considered that Negro work. They did not want to do Negro toil because they saw it as degrading. That is why many of the OG unionists in this country, the Irish, the Germans, etc., had such visceral reactions to black people trying to join unions and competing with freeborn black labor. They thought that they were being driven down to the level of black people who they associated with slavery. America imported a proletariat, a working class from Africa, a proletariat permanently chained in an internal colony, laboring for the benefit of all settlers. African workers might be individually owned like tools and draft animals by some settlers and not others, but in their colonial subjugation, they were as a whole owned by the entire Euro American nation. So if you do not base your analysis of slavery around these facts that Sakai is spitting in settlers, like your analysis is going to be settler chauvinist because you're not dealing with the primary contradiction, the foundation on which this country is built. So, common fucking sense. Slavery was not good. DeSantis is trying to flip the script. And he's not just saying that black people benefited from slavery. He's not just saying that black people were taught new skills that definitely served us in the free, happy America of the 1870s and 1880s. No, he's going further. He's going to go further because this curriculum is going to be teaching people shit like the purpose of the Stop Woke Act, and I'm going to paraphrase here because I haven't read it in its entirety. The purpose of the Stop Woke Act is basically to make white people feel less guilty. You cannot teach about white privilege. You cannot teach about you cannot teach critical race theory, which is not taught. Like you do not teach critical race theory in fucking elementary school. So teachers are being punished for, especially black and Hispanic teachers, are being punished for teaching America's true history. They can't teach stuff like this in Florida. Florida is basically a fascist dictatorship. So, what fascists do is they take the stuff that is most palatable to the majority. Because, okay, yeah, white people don't like feeling that their ancestors did horrible things, even though they knew that their ancestors did horrible things. So, white people are good at sweeping shit under the rug, right? They're good at sweeping shit under the rug. Oh, we don't talk about that anymore. That was a long time ago. Things are better now. We fought the Civil War. Shit like that. So, what DeSantis is trying to do is codify it and teach revisionist history. But again, that has a foundation in history. This is not the first time we've been down this road of settler stupidity. Interesting class breakdown. The Euro American class structure at the time of the 70-75 War of Independence was revealing. 80% bourgeois and petty bourgeois, 10% capitalists, big planters, large merchants, etc., 20% large farmers, professionals, tradesmen, and other upper middle class elements, 40% small landowning farmers, 10% artisans, blacksmiths, coopers, carpenters, shipwrights, etc. 15% temporary workers, usually soon moving up into the ranks of the small farmers, 5% laborers, 5% proletariat. So, America's the first outright bourgeois country in the history of the world. So, yeah, fuck, fuck, fuck. So, how did enslaved people live? Let's focus on women because women were doubly fucked. They were used as sex slaves and also as fucking peons, as pawns. They had them in the fields, they had them working in houses. And while they were in the houses, they were exposed to the horrible behavior of not just the master, but his jealous wife. So, a day in the life of an enslaved lady's maid. Let's see.
I'm a living historian, and I live and work in the spaces of Black folks throughout society in order to better understand their lives. From the north to the south, east to west, join us in learning about the day-to-day lives of Black folks throughout North American society. This is Not Your Mama's History presents These Roots. This month, we're at Stratford Plantation, exploring what the day-to-day life was like for enslaved persons who worked in the great houses of plantations in colonial Virginia. Stratford Hall was home to 4 generations of the Lee family. Like the Washingtons, the Randolphs, and the Carters, they had land, money, and lots of enslaved persons that made their lavish lifestyle possible. And today, I'll show you what it was like for enslaved ladies' maids. We don't know specifically which of the enslaved women would have attended to the lady of the great house at Stratford Hall Plantation. But Fick, who is listed in Philip Ludwell Lee's 1776 probate, could have possibly been Elizabeth Steptoe Lee's enslaved lady's maid. A lady's maid's job was not as laborious as other enslaved persons, but it was just as exhausting physically and mentally. Her skills were many. She was in charge of dressing her mistress, changing.
Look. Okay. People had ladies' maids and stuff like this. Like some of the big planters, like they literally had livery. Like they literally had outfits for their coachman, the guy who drove his carriage, the guys and women who cooked and served in the house. Like they were basically trying to imitate European aristocracy. For them to have fought a war against Europe, they really, really had a thing for trying to emulate great houses and high-level aristocrats in Europe and France. Like all of their furniture and stuff came from France. They sent their kids to France or to Britain to be educated. They were obsessed with Europe. Except instead of peasants, they had slaves working in their land. And the funny thing is that like Europeans saw these people as trash. Like they would not let their kids marry them, marry their daughters or marry their sons because they saw these people as upstarts and basically no better than fucking peasants. Because old Europe was obsessed with breeding in family and inbreeding. Why would you marry an American upstart who has several thousand acres of cotton and horrible boorish manners and is a drunk and a gambler when you can marry your very well-bred cousin?
Changing her mistress' clothes throughout the day, she trained in the care of clothing, hairdressing, makeup creation, and application. She was her mistress' stylist and was expected to keep up with latest fashions, and even sometimes acted as a dressmaker and milliner. And while literacy was not required, it was designed.
So every fucking thing. Like what exactly does the white woman do? Nothing. So you've got 2 or 3 black women who don't have time to take care of their own kids because they're too busy giving you the latest fucking hairstyle from France.
Desirable in order to keep up with the latest fashion trends. A well-known ladies' maid was Ona Judge, who was ladies' maid to Martha Washington. Ona would later escape, citing a desire to simply be a free person. According to enslavers, skilled ladies' maids were hard to come by, so their financial value was high. Her day started around 7:30 a.m., a bit later than other enslaved servants. Her schedule was not set and dictated by the schedule of her enslavers. Simply put, she rose when her enslavers did. The dress and hygiene of enslaved servants in the house were strictly regulated by the enslavers. Unlike their brethren in the fields who tended to have more control over dress and hairdressing, enslaved servants' hair, clothing, and deportment were closely monitored. Hair, skin, and nails were expected to be visibly free of dirt, even though soap was not always allotted to enslaved servants. They were expected to independently find ways of keeping themselves clean to the eyes and pleasing to the nose. The clothing of the enslaved was different on every plantation. What an enslaved servant in the household wore was dependent on the enslaver's wealth, station, and style. A lady's maid could be given hand-me-downs from her enslaver, sent to a dressmaker to have clothes made for her, or be ordered to make them herself. We do not know what an
So not only do you have to take care of every aspect of this white person's hygiene and well-being, you got to bathe this person, you've got to make clothes not just for her, but for yourself too. Beneficial though.
enslaved servant at Stratford Hall Plantation would have worn. But looking at images of European ladies' maids and runaway ads, we have an idea. Sarah, described as a Negro woman enslaved as a house servant and seamstress in Prince George County. She carried with her several changes of apparel, among which are remembered a red and white calico jacket and petticoat, a white holland and blue plains ditto, a red flannel petticoat, a purple cloth cloak, a black furred hat with a gold band, button, and loop, a black silk hat, several white linen shifts and aprons, a spotted yarn rug and Dutch blanket, a pair of English-made leather shoes, and several pairs of thread, cotton, and worsted stockings with a
Yeah, that shit is hot. You're in fucking Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, and you've got 3 fucking layers of clothing on.
small red leather trunk. At Stratford Hall, enslaved servants lived either in the quarters, in the Great House, or in slave quarters a ways away from the Great House. In 1759, at about the age of 16, Elizabeth Steptoe married 32-year-old Philip Ludwell Lee.
Wait, did they just say that a 16-year-old married a 32-year-old? Jesus Christ.
Becoming the mistress of Stratford Hall. This would have been an advantageous match for her family, as Philip Ludwell Lee was a well-connected member of the Virginia gentry, elected to many governmental positions over his life. Elizabeth, most likely, would have been trained all her life to take on this position. The operation of a manor home fell to the mistress. Her main job was as overseer of the house, in charge of directing, supervising, and disciplining all enslaved workers within the domestic sphere.
If you read slave narratives, the owners of the plantation oftentimes were more lenient than the owner's wife. Because like she just said, the wife was responsible for a lot of the discipline of people inside the house. Like there's accounts of the owner's wife just picking up a fire poker and jabbing it through somebody, or throwing irons at people, or just getting a hairbrush or a stick or a broom and just beating the fuck out of the lady that's doing her hair because I don't know, she hit a snag or something. So very brutal, very cruel.
She was also in charge of deciding what meals were served every day.
Oh, what do we do about eggs today, though?
If you don't mind, may I suggest that we go down to see Benjamin and his wife down in Chantilly. They raise and sell chicken eggs.
Have you noticed how he's looking down or looking away? Because during this period, even during the Jim Crow period, black people were not allowed to look white people in the eyes. You either looked down or you looked away. My grandma told me that when she used to go to town, when she was down south, black people were not allowed to walk on the sidewalk. That shit comes from slavery. White people walked on the sidewalk, black people walked in the street. So that's why he's looking down and looking away.
Yourself.
Well, that's a fine plan. You may do that. Oh, and while I'm thinking about it, the Randolphs are coming to the midday meal.
She was also organizing social gatherings.
And especially because this is a man and this is a woman, like a black man looking a white woman in the eyes, no. Your ass would be swinging before the sun went down.
Entertaining guests, keeping up with household expenses, and when her husband was away, a business partner. Though her job was challenging, she most likely, rarely, or if ever, got her hands physically dirty doing domestic chores. All that fell to an army of enslaved workers. She most likely didn't even put on her own clothes, as that job usually fell to enslaved ladies' maid in wealthy households such as this.
Maybe Mr. Carter, if he's home and not in his townhouse, and whatever children he might have around.
Keeping up with the latest hairstyling and fashion was imperative.
I couldn't do a job like this. I'm sorry. Like, I cannot cosplay a fucking slave. And that white woman that's cosplaying the owner, like, I wonder what's going through her fucking head. Does she like this? Like, having fond ancestral memories brought back to you? Like, I'm sorry. You cannot pay me enough in the fucking world. You cannot pay me enough. There's not enough money in the world for me to play dress up and act like a slave. Every fucking day, living history, my ass. I do want to do Civil War reenactment, though, but there's very few United States Colored Troops reenactment companies. In my state, Missouri, it was mostly bandits. Yeah, like, she's sitting up here fucking smiling while this black woman is playing with your fucking hair. I couldn't do that shit.
To pleasing a young mistress.
Last summer, maybe it was the summer before, his daughter came down to the table and she put her hand in front of the
And then, why does she keep fucking talking? Like, shut up. Like, damn, nobody cares. Like, this woman, this enslaved woman, is not going to ever have the chance to own a fucking plantation. And she doesn't give a shit about the Randolphs, the Lees, the Lightfoots, the Apple Strudel Thwaites, or any of these white people. Like, why are you fucking talking? It's like, so what? This woman has to be your therapist too?
in front of her face. And when her father inquired what had happened, and of course made her remove the hand, he discovered that she'd shaved off her eyebrows.
She
Can you believe it? She tried to blame it on her brother, but, he's quite the troublemaker, but he clearly did not do this. It turns out she...
An enslaved
I hope that's arsenic. Like, this offers a good opportunity to just poison the shit out of everybody. Slaves did do that a lot, by the way.
lady's maid had to walk a tightrope. She had to always be aware that the familiarity she enjoyed with her mistress was a one-sided friendship. Her mistress could share all her worries with her, but she could not share all her worries with her enslaver.
That is the real definition of emotional labor. So you have to listen to this white woman talk about her stupid ass rich person problems while you can't tell her husband not to sell your fucking husband or not to sell your kids. But you get to listen to this lady whine about somebody shaving off their eyebrows. That is the definition of emotional labor, not somebody being mean to you on Twitter.
A form of code switching was employed. An enslaved lady's maid had to be intelligent and creative enough to be useful, yet docile and meek as not to intimidate and offend.
This is actually done by a black woman historian. I would not be watching this if this was made by fucking white people.
a people person that can read moods in order to anticipate her mistress' needs. She was also a pipeline of information from the enslaver's home to the enslaved community. It was important for her to understand that the flow of information could go both ways if she was careless. A member of the enslaved community, she knew many of its secrets. At times, members of the enslaved community may implore her to speak with their enslaver.
The enslaved community.
About things that concern them, such as clothing allotments, travel passes, medical care, and family member whereabouts, as well as slave sales. It was usually those that interacted with the enslavers the most that heard about upcoming slave sales first, and could, if they chose, provide an early warning system to the enslaved community. An enslaved lady's maid usually traveled with her enslaver.
So you cannot put on your fucking clothes. My God, this is boring.
A
What is this?
confidant,
What is this fucking harpsichord baroque shit?
thick sewed clothes that she could never wear, and made makeup that she could never use. In addition to their main duties, ladies' maids also did general housekeeping work. Vic would have been expected to stay awake and close by until her mistress was ready for bed. She could be expected to stay up until the rising sun, depending on which guests are there.
They done up there yet?
Of course not. They're gonna be up there till 2 a.m.
I never know when to cook my own.
Eat you out of house and home.
Well, I tell you, I'm about done with this here. How about going up, see where they are, and come back down and let me know.
All right, will do. We don't know the end of Vic's.
Yes, they knew what 2 a.m. was. They had clocks. Big ass grandfather clocks. A day in the life of an enslaved cook. This dude.
Historian, and I live and work in the spaces of Black folks throughout society in order to better understand their lives.
Jesus, this is like the 1700s, not fucking 1125.
From the north to the south, east to west.
People had pocket watches. They had big ass grandfather clocks that they had in their parlors. People knew what time it was.
Join us and learn.
Like, they would blow a big ass fucking horn to wake your ass up if you were enslaved, to get your ass in the field. If you didn't get up when it was time to when it was time to go fucking work, they'd come and beat the fuck out of you. So you kind of had to know what time it was.
Learning about the day-to-day lives of Black folks throughout North American society. This is Not Your Mama's History presents These Roots.
If they don't talk about how cooks routinely poisoned slave owners, I'm going to be highly upset.
This month, we're at Stratford Plantation, exploring what the day-to-day life was like for enslaved persons who worked in the great houses of plantations in colonial Virginia.
I don't know, hop in your time machine and go back to 1790, whatever the fuck, and ask them what time it is.
Today, I'm joined by my friend Dontavius Williams, who is a historical interpreter, living historian, and founder of Chronicles of Adam. He will be representing the enslaved head cook for Stratford Hall, Caesar. I will be assisting him in the kitchen as an enslaved scullery maid. Today, we're going to center on the time period in which Philip Ludwell Lee was the owner of Stratford Hall Plantation from 1750.
Bruh, what the fuck? What is that painting? What is that I can't. I can't. Did he think that he's an actual like Roman or something? I mean, yeah, I know the early Americans had like a really big ancient Rome fetish, but like, bruh. And this is a cap of liberty. How are you a slave owner and you have a cap of liberty?
To 1775. He was known to frequently entertain friends, family, politicians, and business associates at Stratford. He updated the buildings and grounds to receive Virginia's gentry in style. The estate year-round boasted parties and dances with the who's who of Virginia society. Food and drink was at the center of entertaining in 18th century Virginia, and a skilled cook was important to any Virginia gentry family hoping to gain and maintain social connections. The first person up in the morning was always the scullery maid, in order to start the fires for the cook. About 30 minutes to an hour after the scullery maid, the head cook awoke. Just like today, colonial kitchens were a dictatorship, not a democracy. An efficient kitchen was led by a cook who ran their kitchens like a conductor leads an orchestra. Even though his title was cook, his job was more equivalent to what we refer to today as a chef. For that reason, we'll be using that title for him today. He had to have a masterful hold on running a kitchen. Also, he had to master French, English, Dutch, German, and West African-inspired dishes, even developing some dishes of his own. A well-known enslaved chef of the day was Hercules, who before he liberated himself from bondage, was enslaved by George Washington. George Washington.
Also, you notice a lot of like classic European-inspired names, Hercules, fucking Cato, like they did that to mock slaves. They also would do shit like name them after like historical African figures that were around in Roman times. So you had a lot of Scipios and Hannibals running around.
Step-grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, would later in life speak about how the kitchens were run under Hercules.
Precisely. They are just like dog names.
Under his iron discipline, he said, "Woe to his underlings if speck or spot could be discovered on the tables or dressers, or if utensils did not shine like polished silver."
Also, like, you see those, like, nice looking, like, those slave quarters look like nice little English cottages. Like, that's what the average English worker would live in, but only the rich could afford to build shit like that for their slaves. If you were owned by like a really, really poor owner, like you were only like one of 3 slaves, like you lived in a shack or you slept on the floor in the big house, which the big house was probably more like those than a huge white pillared antebellum plantation. So when you read slave narratives, like they always say that the poor slave owners were the worst. Those were the ones that would rent slaves from other people and beat the fuck out of them, etc. So granted, you would not want to be owned by anybody, but every slave narrative that I've read would say that it was better to be owned by a rich guy than by a poor guy.
We can assume that Caesar ran his kitchens in a similar fashion. Caesar most likely trained under an indentured cook from London named Richard Minette in the early 1750s. In the 1776 probate inventory, Caesar was valued at 45 pounds sterling, pointing to the fact that even in his 50s, an age when the perceived financial value of other enslaved workers was considered to be in decline, his skills were still highly valued to both his enslavers and a slave society. Even though he was one of the most skilled chefs in the area, with years of experience, the final say on all meals went to the mistress of the plantation, who at age 17 was a little under half Caesar's age. Elizabeth Steptoe Lee did not legally own enslaved persons, but she was given ultimate authority over the enslaved in the domestic sphere at Stratford Hall Plantation. She commanded the household enslaved staff and structure of the household. Though her job was challenging, she rarely, if ever, got her hands physically dirty doing domestic chores.
Did this lady just say her job was challenging? What are you talking about?
She did, however, meet with the cook every morning to go over the day's bill of fare.
Like you've got this poor woman that we've just watched. You've got this poor lady whose job it is to tend to your every need. She gets up when you get up. She sleeps when you sleep. She does your hair. She puts on and takes off your clothes. You've got this dude to cook for you who I hope is slowly poisoning you so you die in misery and agony. You don't have to lift a finger to do anything, but your job is challenging. Like, what job? You have no job.
Good morning, Caesar.
Good morning, mistress.
How are our hens faring?
They faring just fine. Only thing is,
Also, like, this is obviously cosplay. Like, slave owners' wives did not give a shit, like, how their hands were faring. They cared about how you were working. How much cotton did Caesar pick today?
they're not laying so well this month, but Jack assured me that he's changing their feed and they'll be just fine.
Oh. What do we do about eggs today, though?
If you don't mind, may I suggest that we go down to see Benjamin and his wife down in Chantilly? They raise and sell chicken eggs themselves.
Well, that's a fine plan. You may do that. Oh, and while I'm thinking about it, the Randolphs are coming to the midday meal. Perhaps we could have one of our eggless friends on the table. And I would also like oysters on the half shell.
Indeed. We even have some beef that was left over that I can make into a fine beef soup.
Let's see, again, I can't. You cannot pay me. I don't give a fuck if you're paying me $350,000 a year. I'm not doing this. I'm absolutely not. Just bruh. His eyes are looking down. He's stuttering and mumbling. He knows how to talk. He's stumbling and bruh. This is too fucking real for me. Too fucking real.
That and some pickled asparagus will go real well with those hens there.
I would like
Like
that.
imagine, like, I'm not mad at either the brother or the sister, but like, just imagine the trauma that you have to go through. You're reliving the shit that your ancestors went through, and this is your job. You do this for a living, day after day after day after day after day. You play a fucking slave? Nope.
Parsnips, too. The usual time will do.
Yes, sir. Hey, Cheney.
Yes, sir.
I need you to go to the root cellar and grab some carrots. Make sure you wash them real good. Bring them back and cut them up so we can put them in this beef soup.
Yes, sir. Even though the Lees were a wealthy family and could enjoy luxuries such as fresh meat year-round and a large variety of food, meals would depend on what's in season. During the colder months, Caesar would rely heavily on drawing ingredients from stores in the root cellar. Pickles and vegetables such as carrots, parsnips, potatoes, beets, cabbage, turnips, winter squash, pumpkins, and onions were a regular part of people's diets.
And yeah, the Clintons did use slave labor. They had They had a lady come in from the women's prison to watch Chelsea while they were doing imperialist things and crooked things. So, yeah, people still use slave labor, even though it's technically paid. But yeah, they had a prisoner, a black woman prisoner, come and basically serve as a nursemaid to Chelsea when they were living in the governor's mansion in Arkansas. And if I recall correctly, they've never apologized or even mentioned this lady.
Winter. It was important for Caesar to keep a close eye on all the food stores throughout the year. Remember, one bad apple can spoil the whole bunch, and Caesar was constantly checking the stores for that bad apple.
Hey, Cheney.
Oh, you want to see something wild? Let me show you. This is actually a literal farmer slave plantation.
The Louisiana
Look at this. If you go down south, this is how they do their prisoners. This is Angola farm. They call it the farm in Louisiana. They've literally got them out there working like they're back in the day.
State Penitentiary in Angola is one of America's most unusual prisons because it is, in some ways, a plantation. Once you pass through Angola's front gate, you can't help but feel that you've gone back in time to another South.
It's the largest maximum security prison in the country. Right now, there are 6,300 prisoners. The majority of murderers, you have rapists, you have people who've committed assault, drug felonies.
How long are you here for? Next 40 years? What was the charge? 4 counts?
Roughly 75% of the prisoners are here serving life sentences without the possibility of parole.
Bro, look at that dog foaming at the mouth.
Louisiana has some of the toughest sentencing laws in the country, and these guys are not going home.
I just put in a little bit of that. I don't want the Atlantic to copyright fuck me. But yeah, that's how slavery was, okay? And you think it was just like that in America? No. Saint-Domingue, soon to become Haiti, was even worse. Read you an excerpt from The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. Very good revolutionary historian. For the least fault, the slaves received the harshest punishment. In 1685, the Negro Code authorized whipping, and in 1702, one colonist, a marquis, thought that any punishment which demanded more than 100 blows of the whip was serious enough to be handed over to the authorities. Later, the number was fixed at 39, then raised to 50, but the colonists paid no attention to these regulations, and slaves were not unfrequently whipped to death. The whip was not always an ordinary cane or woven cord as the code demanded. Sometimes it was replaced by the rigouat, or thick thong of cowhide, or by the lion, local growths of reeds, supple and pliant like whalebone. The slaves received the whip with more certainty and regularity than they received their food. It was the incentive to work and the guardian of discipline. But there was no ingenuity that fear or a depraved imagination could devise, which was not employed to break their spirit and satisfy the lusts and resentment of their owners and guardians. Here are some more examples of torture that were used in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, soon to become Haiti. Why did it become Haiti? Because of shit like this. Irons on the hands and feet. Blocks of wood that the slaves had to drag behind them wherever they went. The tin plate mask designed to prevent the slaves eating the sugar cane. What else? The iron collar. Whipping was interrupted in order to pass a piece of hot wood on the buttocks of the victim. Salt, pepper, citron, cinders, aloes, and hot ashes were then poured on the bleeding wounds. Mutilations were common. Limbs, ears, and sometimes the private parts, to deprive them of the pleasures which they can indulge in without expense. Their masters poured burning wax on their arms and hands and shoulders, emptied the boiling cane sugar over their heads, burned them alive, roasted them on slow fires, filled them with gunpowder and blew them up with a match, buried them up to the neck and smeared their heads with sugar so that the flies would devour them, fastened them near to nests of ants and wasps, made them eat their excrement, drink their urine, and lick the saliva of other slaves. And we wonder why the French people gave us the Marquis de Sade. One colonist was known in moments of anger to throw himself on his slaves and sink his teeth into their flesh. Impossible as it is to substantiate hundreds of cases, yet all the evidence shows that these bestial practices were normal features of slavery life. The torture of the whip, for instance, had 1,000 refinements, but there were regular varieties that they had special names, so common were they. When the hands and arms were tied to 4 posts on the ground, the slave was set to undergo the 4 post. If the slave was tied to a ladder, it was the torture of the ladder. If he was suspended by 4 limbs, it was the hammock, etc. The pregnant woman was not spared her 4 posts. A hole was dug in the earth to accommodate the unborn child. Did they care about the unborn child itself as a human being? No. They cared about money. They did not want to destroy their money. The torture of the collar was specially reserved for women who were suspected of abortion, and the collar never left their necks until they had produced a child. The blowing up of a slave had its own name: to burn a little powder in the ass of the N-word. Obviously, this was no freak, but a recognized practice. And we wonder why the Haitian Revolution was so brutal. So, sexual assault on plantations. Abolitionists worked tirelessly in the mid-19th century to bring public attention to the plight of the sexually assaulted on plantations. Frederick Douglass, you all should know who he is, recalled in his first autobiography the uncertainty surrounding the identity of his biological father. My father was a white man. He was admitted to be such by all I'd ever heard speak of my parentage. The opinion was also whispered that my master was my father, but of the correctness of this opinion I know nothing. The means of knowing was withheld from me. So, there were, because we already mentioned this, okay? Those ladies' maids, all those scullery maids, all those women that worked in the house, they were property. They were for the disposal of the slaver as they saw fit. So they could be raped, all sorts of other horrible things. And there was even a name for the children that white men produced with their women slaves, children of the plantation. Everybody knew where they came from. That is partly why white women were so abusive towards black women on the plantation, because their husbands were cheating on them with the slaves. So, very substantiated and very long account of the abuse that black women suffer on these plantations. Harriet Jacobs, in her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, also recalled the uncaring attitude of the white mistress towards raped black women. Jacob's mistress, suspicious of her husband's behavior, ordered Jacob to confess the rapacious actions of the master. Initially, Jacobs and the mistress seemed to share common pain in the ordeal. However, Jacobs realized her pain and that of the mistress were entirely different. I was soon convinced, says Jacobs, that her emotions arose from anger and wounded pride. She felt that her marriage vows were desecrated, her dignity insulted, but she had no compassion for the poor victim of her husband's perfidy. She pitied herself as a martyr, but was incapable of feeling for the condition of shame and misery in which her unfortunate, helpless slave was placed. Jacobs would lament that it was criminal for a favorite slave to wish to be virtuous, aka not be raped. Harkening back to Celia's plight, Jacobs reminds us that for an enslaved woman to control herself and refuse any sexual advance was essentially illegal because you were property. If you disobeyed your master, he was literally legally allowed to shoot you on the spot, or torture you to death, or rape you to death. But again, this is what DeSantis says was beneficial to black people because it taught us how to make iron and steel into implements. Like, this trauma still impacts us to this day. To this day. 150, 160 fucking years ago. Yet, we still have various sorts of mental hangups that derived from the shit we went through on these plantations and in these rich people's houses. Like slavery, it was not just cotton slavery, it was not just tobacco slavery, it was not just sugar slavery, it was also sexual slavery. There was a practice called fancy girls, where extremely light skinned black women, who in many cases, in most cases, had more white ancestors than black ancestors, were purchased. This was really centered around New Orleans and Kentucky. They were purchased and they were forced to live in brothels. You basically had enslaved prostitutes, and rich white dudes on their jaunts into town would visit these brothels and rape these women because they were so close to white appearance. But they were legally enslaved because they had 3 or 4 or 5 black ancestors. Yeah. Bill of sale for a girl named Clary purchased by Robert Jardine for £50 sterling. Black women were the sexual prey of white men since the 1600s. During the domestic slave trade, a new category of enslaved women emerged known as fancy girls. Young and usually light skinned, these black women were purchased for explicitly for sexual orientation, exploitation, at rates 4 to 5 times the price of women field laborers from the Smithsonian. So, how many people ended up over here? Let's see. This is basically a data aggregation site. It shows like who came. Brazil actually didn't abolish slavery until 1888, if I recall correctly. So these numbers are in the thousands. So very few slaves were taken to Europe because, like, what the fuck are slaves going to do in Europe besides be house servants? So mainland North America. These are the totals down here. Mainland North America only saw 366,183 slaves that were brought here. So we ended up with millions of slaves because slave breeding. Like, it became illegal to import slaves, so you had literal farms that had no purpose except to breed Africans. And then they would sell these Africans away from their families. So this is human trafficking. The Caribbean, they brought 5,091,678 slaves there because it was easy to die there. Because not only did you have crazy Frenchmen blowing powder up black people's ass or torturing them to death, but, like, if I recall correctly, the average life expectancy on a plantation in Saint Domingue was like shit 9 or 10 months. So that's why they would just import more. Spanish mainland America, 649,248. Brazil, 3,522,235. Between the years 1851 and 1875, you had 9,798 slaves trafficked. Africa. So this is, I guess, they were taken out of the parts of Africa, 169,000. So total, 10,005,395. That's the population of an entire country. Let's see maps. I like maps. So this shows where most of the slaves were taken from and where they were brought. You've got all these parts of the zoom out, please. Thank you. All these parts of the continent, various ports that they took people from. My ancestors were actually, like, from around this region. I also have ancestors from the Congo down here. I took one of those fancy DNA tests. But yeah, you've got Yoruba land over here. Oh, where did they end up? You've got the trade routes here. You've got French and English islands here. Brazil. and Jamaica, Cuba. So this was a thriving trade. Shitloads of money. Money that still exists today, by the way, is was made off of this shit. So let's talk about um slavery in Brazil. Because like Brazil is probably the most African country in the Americas. So did slavery benefit the black people of Brazil? No. Here's a description of the voyage itself. We were thrust into the hold of the vessel in a state of nudity, the males being crammed on one side and the females on the other. The hold was so low that we could not stand up, but were obliged to crouch upon the floor or sit down. Day and night were the same to us. Sleep being denied us from the confined position of our bodies, and we became desperate through suffering and fatigue. Oh, the loathsomeness and filth of that horrible place will never be effaced from my memory. Nay, as long as memory holds her seat in this distracted brain, will I remember that. My heart, even at this day, sickens at the thought of it. The only food we had during the voyage was corn, soaked and boiled. I cannot tell how long we were thus confined, but it seemed a very long while. We suffered very much for want of water, but we was denied all we needed. A pint a day was all that was allowed, and no more, and a great many slaves died upon the passage. There was one poor fellow, desperate for want of water, that he attempted to snatch a knife from the white man who brought in the water when he was taken up on deck, and I never knew what became of him. I supposed he was thrown overboard. That was what they did. They threw him overboard. They would throw you overboard if you got sick. They would throw you overboard if you died. They would throw you overboard if you made too much noise. There's an account of horrible shit, torture, punishing Negroes at Calabuco, Rio de Janeiro. It shows one black man whipping another as a white supervisor observes. How did they sell slaves? For sale, a Creole slave, a skillful shoemaker with a very good figure, about 20 years of age, with no vices or bad habits. His final price is 300,000 reich. Anyone interested in him, we should go to Travessa do Patio number 11 upstairs, where we will find someone to speak to about the matter. And notice that they talk about like the figures of the slaves. They want to see if you're likely for work. Okay, because they're not going to buy you if you're sick. They're not going to buy you if you're old. They're not going to buy you if you're crippled. Okay? And if you're a woman, they obviously want you for other purposes besides work. They want you for sex work. So that's why you keep seeing very good figure, etc. For rent, whoever's interested in renting slaves, well trained in the baker's trade, who could even do any type of work in a house, should go to Rua dos Lacheiros, house number 14, into the textile shop on the Rua de Cano. For rent, a wet nurse with very good milk from her first pregnancy gave birth 6 days ago in the Rua dos Pescadores. Be it advised that she does not have a child. Where the fuck did her child go? So what would happen was they would rent wet nurses because white women were seen as being too valuable, too precious to nurse their own kids. So they would rent black enslaved women to breastfeed white kids. So yeah, they probably her kid either died or they sold her kid. We'll trade a good black boy, Moleke, 15 or 16 years of age, accustomed to the country, a good cook, does all the work of the house, makes purchases, does washing, for a wet nurse who has good milk, who also knows how to take care of a house and who is without vices. Whoever wants to buy a Creole slave, still a young girl, with good milk and in great quantity, who gave birth 20 days ago, should go to Rua das Marecas, facing towards the public plaza. So, yeah. Sex trafficking and milk trafficking. Was there resistance? Yes, there was. Because you cannot make a slave out of a person. You cannot enslave somebody and expect them to be okay with it. You could brainwash them, but you still got the machete hovering over your neck there. Machetes were what they used. That was the main weapon of the Haitian Revolution in its early stages, the machete. Why would you give a slave a machete? Because they need to cut sugarcane, but they can also take it and chop your head off with it. So, various accounts of resistance. Rebellions plagued slave owners and colonial governments throughout the era of transatlantic slave trade and slavery, most famously during the Age of Revolutions on the French Caribbean islands of Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. In Saint-Domingue, enslaved people allied themselves with various free people of color in the colony to transform the rebellion into a full-scale revolution that brought an end to slavery in French colonies within 3 years. Granted, Napoleon tried to bring it back, but Napoleon got his ass whooped. Maroon colonies in the Americas. The institution of slavery was threatened when large groups of Africans escaped to geographically secluded regions. And the funny thing is, like, most of these regions actually had like parallels to the regions in Africa that these people came from. Many efforts were made by European militaries to track down and destroy Maroon communities, but those attempts were normally rebuffed by the Maroons because these were masters of guerrilla warfare. They learned how to wage guerrilla warfare in Africa because that's how they fought in Africa. For example, the British were unable to defeat the Maroons in Jamaica and therefore established a treaty with them. The Black Caribs of St. Vincent and Maroons in Suriname did the same. Maroon communities also existed in Africa from those who fled slave raiders or escaped from coffles along interior trade routes. Maroons also can be found in certain areas of North America, including the Great Dismal Swamp straddling North Carolina, Virginia, and the Bas des Fleuves region of Louisiana. Maroons survived by returning runaway slaves. Not all the time. Many of these treaties did specify that Maroons were to return runaway slaves. They also made indigenous people do that, but depending on the relation of the particular colony or Maroon town with the authorities, with the colonizers, in many cases, they ignored the stipulation. In many cases, like especially in Cuba, like they would raid plantations to actually get people to add to their colonies. And if you didn't join them, they would kill you. So not all of the time, but yeah, the treaties, in many cases stipulated that no new runaways were to be added. This is Nanny, probably the most famous Maroon. Much of Nanny's early life is unknown, including her birthplace. What is certain, however, is that she and other enslaved people sought refuge from a brutal slave society in the mountains of Jamaica, where together they established a Maroon community. In 1720, Nanny had become the leader of a Maroon settlement, Nannytown, located in the Blue Mountain region. At the same time that Nanny headed this community, her contemporaries Cujo, Akabong, Kofi, and Kwacho, these are all African names, by the way, West African names. I think they're either Akan or Yoruba. Led other Maroon communities in Jamaica, but the nature of her relationship to them is not known. Nanny trained her Maroon warriors in the art of guerrilla warfare. It is also said that she was a great Obia woman. Obia is used to refer to basically the syncretic African traditional religion that is practiced in the English Caribbean, and worked magic to protect her warriors from their British enemies. The British fought Nanny and her Maroon troops from 1728 to 1734. In 1734, British commander Stoddard destroyed Nannytown and claimed to have killed all the Maroons residing there. In fact, Stoddard had not destroyed the Maroons, nor did he kill Nanny. She and some of her survivors took refuge, it is believed, near the Rio Grande in Jamaica. In 1739, another Maroon leader, Cujo, signed a peace treaty with the Brits. Later, as a result of that treaty, Nanny and her Maroons were granted 500 acres of land upon which to settle. The settlement that emerged on this land was dubbed New Nanny Town. So, example of what happens when you actually resist and don't submit meekly. This is the Great Dismal Swamp. So there were Maroons here in the United States. A lot of people don't know that. This is the Great Dismal Swamp. So let's see what happened out there.
The Dismal Swamp is an environment that has hazardous conditions associated with it. The heat, you got poisonous snakes, and mosquitoes come out at certain times of the year, and it's unbearable. But when you think about some of the torture the enslaved people endured, I think if most of us were living during that day and we had an option to go in the swamp and live freely, I think a lot of us would take that option.
From the 17th century until the Civil War, escaped slaves, known as Maroons, found refuge in the Great Dismal Swamp. Located on the border of Virginia and North Carolina, the swamp was wild and inhospitable. Nevertheless, it was there that runaways created self-sufficient communities, almost entirely cut off from the outside world. For the past 10 years, archaeologist Dan Sayers from American University has been studying these settlements.
Part of what I did was develop this sort of research program called the Great Dismal Swamp Landscape Study. Most of my focus has been on archaeological discovery of sites out in the swamp, as well as historical research, and then of course trying to understand it. Before we started our research, there was a sense people lived in the swamp for a variety of reasons, but we really wanted to go in the swamp and find remnants of their lives out there. And sure enough, we've been able to look at several sites associated with several of these different groups. Probably in 1790 to 1825 or 30 nail that we found in one of the resistance community settlements. I'm sure the population went up and down, but very strong potential.
Yeah, you're referring to the area around Saint-Denis in RDR too. Yeah.
For any given moment, for thousands of people that went out in the Great Dismal and formed these multi-generational communities. It was a radical form of resistance in a good way.
The runaways who escaped slavery risked everything to be free, even if it meant living in the harsh environment of the swamp. One former slave who briefly lived in the swamp was a man named Moses Grandy.
I've done family genealogy research in which I've uncovered a slave narrative by Moses Grandy, who I believe is my great-great-grandfather's uncle. That's Edmund Grandy, my great-great-grandfather's headstone, who was born in 1827. He was a waterman and a boatsman on the Dismal Swamp Canal, which was being hand dug. And he describes very vividly.
One thing about canals is that they kill shitloads of people. So, yeah. Imagine digging a canal through a fucking swamp. How many people die? How many mass graves are just waiting to be uncovered in that fucking swamp?
Vividly in the slave narrative, how they were treated, what they endured, how they were tortured. If you had that kind of experience and you had an opportunity to come out to the swamp and live freely under, challenging conditions, you're gonna have a hard time getting them out of there. The idea of Africans setting up communities and being in charge of their destiny in the swamp, I don't want people to ever forget this history.
Meet the Spanish stone lifters. Interesting. There's another account of how Africans basically played colonizing powers off each other and also forged links with indigenous people. Fort Mose.
In the late 1600s, rival imperial powers, Spain and England, shared a border near what became South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Any slave who escaped to Florida from the British colonies was granted their freedom. For the enslaved, Spanish Florida became the first promised land. In 1738, a small group of black people created their own town near St. Augustine. They called it Fort Mose, the first all-black settlement in what is now the United States.
Enslaved folk in South Carolina realized that if they reach Florida, that is not controlled by the English, perhaps they can seek refuge.
300 miles north of Fort Mose, near the Stono River just outside of Charleston, word of the free town to the south reached a group of slaves. This inspired one of the largest slave revolts in the history of the British colonies. One morning in 1739, a group of about 20 black men set out before dawn. As they traveled, they set fire to plantations. Nearly 100 slaves, joined them for the journey. When word of the fugitives'
It's kind of like a long march.
rebellion spread, local militiamen were mobilized.
The Spanish were very cruel with slaves, but they were also very cruel with the British. That just shows how colonizers can be played off each other. Because Spain obviously wasn't going to return them to Britain, which was their enemy, and they also were not going to, like, they weren't Spanish slaves. I mean, I think they would react very differently if these were slaves that were owned by Spaniards running off, but they saw it as a way to hurt the Brits. Plus, you've got people who ran away from the Brits. Why not let them have a fort? You can press gang them into your army if the Brits attack.
And a brutal battle ensued. Many were killed in the clash, and black rebels who were later captured were tried and beheaded in an effort to instill fear.
They did this pretty much after every slave revolt that failed. They would literally catch you, they'd cut your head off, and they'd put your head on spikes along the road to scare the hell out of the remaining black people.
To discourage future rebellions, harsh new slave laws were imposed, including forbidding teaching slaves to read. Within a year, British colonial forces seized Florida from Spain, and Fort Mose was destroyed. But the Stono Rebellion wouldn't be the last time that enslaved black people in the British colonies risked everything to gain their freedom. The drive among black people to end their enslavement would never die.
Black history in 2 minutes or so. Oh, another thing.
It's hard to imagine that Hollywood hasn't jumped all over this. You would think it would be box office gold because it's...
Wait a minute, that's fucking libertarian bullshit. Nobody's watching that.
In the mid-70s...
Oh, Black Seminoles. They ran because Florida has always been like a refuge because you've got the Everglades in the middle and swamps and snakes and other horrible things. White people don't like swamps and snakes and other horrible things. White people like forests, pine forests and cold and log cabins. Black people love swamps. Well, not this black person, but they are very akin to the areas that we were taken from in Africa. So I guess that sort of explains our affinity to it. The indigenous people, they've been here forever. So they like swamps because it helps them hide. So there is an alliance in the creation of actually a new ethnic group called the Black Seminoles from intermarriage between escaped Africans and Seminoles who were hiding out from U.S. fuckery. So let's look at this. There was another one from a group called Students for Liberty. I'm not watching that because fuck libertarians. I have never understood this free slave shit. Like, how does one prove that and what's stopping some white guy from just kidnapping a free black person and selling them into slavery? They did that. But when you're fleeing across borders, it's a bit more difficult because you're not going to return your enemy's slave. And you also have a very useful column if your enemy invades. But yeah, like if you ran off to Pennsylvania from Maryland or something, yeah, they would just grab you and sell you into slavery. They did that a lot.
19th century, an alliance unlike any that had ever been seen before began to form between Native American Seminole tribes and escaped black slaves. The Black Seminoles were a group of freedmen and runaway slaves living in Florida since as early as 1689. Yet, despite the fact that their pairing changed the course of American history, the Black Seminoles were, for the most part, forgotten about. So, today, we're going to tell you some things you never knew about the alliance between Seminole Indians and escaped slaves. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other Native American or Black history. In the late 1600s, Spanish settlers in Florida were in the middle of a serious conflict with the British residents of Carolina, an area which consisted of modern-day Georgia as well as North and South Carolina. As a result, they needed a fort that could act as a buffer to protect them. So in 1681, Fort Mose was founded, just north of St. Augustine. With so many escaped slaves seeking freedom in Spanish Florida, the settlers decided that the fort should be run by freed black men. In total, 38 men ran the fort and established what is now recognized as the very first all-black town in North America. When Florida was later ceded to Britain in the Paris Treaty of 1763, the freedmen were no longer welcome. Many were forced to flee to the Seminole Nation, thus beginning the Seminole Nation's alliance with the Black Seminoles. The relationship between the Black Seminoles and the Native Seminoles was, to say the least, complicated. The two groups were partners of chance who joined together as a team when it was to their benefit and parted ways when it wasn't. They shared much of their respective cultures with one another and further unified themselves by practicing intermarriage over the generations. They were also one of the first American communities to navigate the murky waters of joining two different ethnic groups, something that would become a bit of a motif in American history. While they weren't recognized for it back then, today's scholars are finally beginning to acknowledge the important strides that these two very different groups made by joining together. The home of the Seminole Nation has changed many times and spans across several states and countries. After the War of 1812, both the Native and Black Seminoles moved from northern Florida into the southern and central areas of the state. They were doing their best to get away from encroaching white settlers, which turned out to be a prudent decision. In the early 1820s, a large group even had to escape to the Bahamas. After the Second Seminole War, which ended in 1842, many Seminoles and escaped slaves were removed to yet another new territory in Oklahoma. However, others chose a different path and ended up in Texas and northern Mexico. Around 1816, General Andrew Jackson, the future 7th President of the United States, was charged with the forced removal of any runaway slaves who were being sheltered by the bands of Black Seminoles. To accomplish this task, he adopted a strategy that mostly consisted of the burning and raiding of Seminole villages. These attacks, as you probably aren't surprised to learn, quickly became the catalyst for the first major conflict between the white settlers and the Seminole Nation. Although the Black Seminoles fought back, Jackson captured the Spanish-held cities of Pensacola and St. Marks. Ultimately, the Spanish would end up ceding Florida in 1819, as well as giving up their claims for sovereign Spanish rule in Texas. From 1835 to 1842, the Seminole Nation once again found themselves waging a brutal war against the white settlers who wanted their land. As it happened, the land that had been granted to them by the United States as a reservation turned out to be very desirable to plantation owners looking to expand their operations. Not realizing how valuable the land was when they gave it away, the settlers demanded it back, and the resulting conflict was absolutely devastating. Not wanting to leave their home, the Seminole tribes fought back against the Indian Removal Act. It was a costly war for the United States, with estimates of the expense ranging between $40 and $60 million, which today would be well over $1 billion.
Expansion is a mighty fine thing. Sure, we gotta grow, but not at the expense of the things this country was founded to protect.
Many, if not most, scholars, including those who focused on African American studies, surprisingly overlooked the significance of the Seminole Uprising for a long time. For nearly 150 years, it was all but forgotten, as most history books focused on the role of the native Seminole fighters rather than on the escaped slaves and the Black Seminoles who fought alongside them. From 1835 to 1838, roughly 385 to 465 runaway slaves and 500 to 800 Black Seminoles fought alongside their native Seminole counterparts in the Second Seminole War, forming an even stronger alliance, one that would eventually win them their freedom. On May 28, 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. It still took officials a number of years to actually evict the Seminoles from the land. Many other tribes from across the American Southeast were also forcefully relocated into an area west of the Mississippi that became known as Indian Territory.
You Indians, get out of here! Get out of here! Get out of here! Get out of here! Get!
The Seminoles, however, were marched to New Orleans, where they were placed on a boat that would take them to their new land at Fort Gibson. Having been promised their freedom if they went along, a group of 250 Seminoles, including a large number of Black Seminoles, agreed to the terms of their journey.
The lowest classes of white people are flogging the Cherokees with cowhides, hickories, and clubs. We are not safe in our house.
After the Second Seminole War, white plantation owners quickly realized that it wasn't going to be in their best interest to admit that they were defeated by black rebels. In an attempt to appease both sides, the black members of the rebellion were granted their freedom, and the incident was purposefully swept under the rug of American history. Although slaves had been granted their freedom in other situations, this was the only time before the Civil War where freedom was granted to runaway slaves. When slavery was still being practiced in the southern United States, the plantation owners' grip on power was paramount. Plantation owners had to maintain their control over slaves.
Also, I find it extremely ironic that all of this shit took place in Ron DeSantis' state.
To ensure the continuation of their businesses and the lifestyles that they had established for themselves. This dynamic plays a large role in explaining why the escaped slaves who fought in the Second Seminole War were largely forgotten by history. It was in the plantation owners' interest to downplay any occurrences of slave rebellion, particularly those that were successful, so that other captives wouldn't try it themselves. A system of euphemisms was used in newspapers to get the story out without any African Americans realizing what had happened.
What people don't know is that enslaved people always resisted, always fought for their freedom.
Born in 1812 and also known as Juan Caballo, John Horace was a black Seminole who grew up among the Oconee Seminole. As a boy, he learned to hunt and fish and became proficient with both bows and arrows and rifles. In contrast to many of his contemporaries, John also learned to read and write in several languages. He is known to have a working knowledge of Spanish, English, and the Hichiti tongue, spoken by the Oconee. Among other things, he would go on to lead the largest slave uprising in American history during the Second Seminole War. He also met 2 presidents, was an advisor to multiple Seminole chiefs, and later served as a distinguished officer in the Mexican military. Toward the end of his life, he led his people from Florida to northern Mexico, where he provided them with a safe place to live, a place that his descendants still reside in today. John Horace led an incredible life by anyone's standards, and by the time he died at age 70, he had accomplished his dream of securing a land where his people could live freely.
The stars twinkle as the dirge-like ancestral music of the Indians echoes through the solemn stillness of the night.
The Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole tribes were considered to be the primary Native American nations that white settlers and African Americans had relationships with. The first 4 held slaves for various purposes, and in most cases they worked on large plantations or farms. The Seminole relationship.
Many of those 4 so-called civilized tribes, many of the people that owned slaves in those tribes had very strong connections, even in most cases, biological connections to Europeans. Like, you've got a guy whose dad was white and his mom was a Creek or Cherokee, and he ends up with 500 slaves. Those were also the ones that were aligned with the Confederacy during the Civil War.
With blacks, on the other hand, was quite different, and there was far less chattel slavery involved. Instead, black Seminoles were viewed as free men. Although they never seemed to gain complete acceptance into the Seminole Nation, they still enjoyed far more rights than African Americans in Indian country did. It can sometimes be difficult to determine who was part of a particular ethnic group and who is not. The question becomes much more complicated when a historical reparation payout of $56 million is added into the equation. We're referring to a conflict that arose in 2002 when the federal government awarded a huge settlement to the members of the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma. The situation had already become tense with regard to the acceptance of the black Seminoles into the tribe before that happened, and the money didn't make things any easier when it came to determining who got what. Many of the people arguing for inclusion pointed out that there has been a long history of intermarriage between the black Seminoles and native Seminoles, and that the settlement should be rightfully shared. The black Seminoles attempted to sue the federal government for their share, but in 2004, the United States Supreme Court ruled against them. The court held that the suit couldn't move forward without the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma being joined as a party. However, the Seminoles of Oklahoma refused to join, and as a sovereign nation, the court could not force them to. So what
So yeah, was Andrew Jackson America's craziest president? I don't know. I'd say either Nixon or Johnson has that dubious honor. Here's another one. The
For
slaves that got
virtually
away.
all of the known history of Homo
Like, and the thing, like, I used to not think that there were Maroons in the United States. I used to think that there was a Spanish and Portuguese thing. But like, I've actually read this book called Maroon Colonies, and it talks about it. And then I started watching stuff like this. There were hella Maroons in the United States, not just the Seminoles. Everybody used to duel people with pistols back in the fucking 1820s. That doesn't make him crazy. That makes him an American landowner and slaver.
sapiens, humans were known to have enslaved other human members of other groups, and this is a near universal trait seen in virtually every culture throughout all continents without fail. And it's even possible that our stronger, smarter cousins, the Neanderthal, might have been enslaved by early humans, as it has been found that female Neanderthal lineages can be seen in modern humans, although male Neanderthal lineages cannot. Of course, most people already know that the vast majority of slaves sold from sub-Saharan Africa were not exported to the United States of America, with the bulk that crossed the Atlantic landing all over Latin America, so much that in the present day, the majority of the population of many Latino countries such as the Dominican Republic and Brazil have at least some African ancestry, and in fact, there are about the same number of self-identified blacks in Latin America as there are in the United States, as I discussed in a video some time ago. But in American curriculum, we are told many stories about the toiling work of slaves and a few daring stories of escape, but not really much else, and it would probably come as a surprise to many that although by and large the overwhelming majority of escaped black slaves in the southern US made their way north where they would gain sanctuary, with some even making it as far as Canada, out of blacks that had gained their own freedom by barter, favors, or simply getting lucky and being released in a slave owner's will, many remained in the South. Shockingly enough, in 1860, out of nearly 500,000 free blacks in the U.S., 45% lived in southern states, with 15% of free blacks in the region owning slaves themselves, although the bulk of this community were mulattoes of significant European heritage, many being nearly indistinguishable from other whites, yet because of the one-drop rule that instilled the strict racial dichotomy seen there, were considered colored in the United States Census. This rule is what largely helped these various communities of African or partial African descent to coalesce into a single ethnic population following the emancipation process. Most fall under mainstream American culture, but this is definitely, and many pardos are less European than blacks during the war and up until
This looks like some fucking
his death from many different tribes and nations throughout
nutty
Africa,
shit.
with a substantial percentage being Muslims. The Quilombolas incited several slave rebellions in northeast Brazil in the 17th century, which resulted in a great ire being directed towards them by the Portuguese officials, and the chief Quilombola settlement was raided, and the entirety of the community was believed to be killed or enslaved by the Portuguese and later the Brazilians. Fascinatingly, it was not until nearly 3 centuries later in the 1970s that it was discovered that the Quilombolas were not entirely eradicated as once thought, as a small group had escaped to the sparsely populated interior of Alagoas and other states in the northeast, some having integrated with Amerindian villages, and others having established their own communities hidden in the jungles for generations, having a far more African-derived culture than other African-descended people of Brazil, and are treated much in the same regard as indigenous Brazilians in the present day. Another similar community in Latin America, where descendants of escaped slaves are for the most part known collectively as Maroons, were the Palenquero of northern Colombia, who similarly are the descendants of blacks who escaped slavery from cities on the Caribbean coast and fled further inland, creating the village of San Basilio de Palenque. And the Palenquero today speak a unique Creole form of Spanish, arguably the only form of Creole Spanish in the Americas, being heavily influenced by Amerindian and African languages, and outside of this, there were many cases of escaped black slaves integrating into Amerindian villages, just as there were in the United States to a lesser extent. So there were indeed Maroon communities in English-speaking British colonies. It was just with the United States having such a large white population and density compared to the West Indies, it was far more difficult for escaped slaves to actually form their own communities in secret, which was why
Which is why we ran off to the swamps, because white people are afraid of swamps.
overwhelming majority, especially in the twilight years of the antebellum South, chose to trek north rather than stay put. The British West Indian colonies initially had white majorities, with the Irish being used en masse as indentured servants in Barbados and elsewhere, and in fact the majority of Afro-Caribbean populations from Anglo countries have at least some Irish ancestry in their heritage. But as the slave population increased higher and higher on the West Indian islands, more and more of the non-slave owning whites of these islands decided to leave in kind, mostly to the United States, largely homogenizing them. This also came with the consequence of large-scale uproar and dissatisfaction among the plantation working slave population, outnumbering their masters 200 to 1 in some areas, and hence a large number of slave
200 to 1.
rebellions were set off across the Caribbean. Unfortunately for most, there really was nowhere to run on some of the smaller islands, but on Jamaica, maroon communities had existed since before the British even took control of the island, a relic of slaves who had escaped to the mountainous interior from the Spaniards, and during the British conquest of the island, many more slaves fled to the mountains. So, as you can tell, although European colonial powers were never overly fond of these independent maroon communities, thinking they might incite further slave rebellions or escapes, most were perfectly content with taking advantage of them in defeating common enemies, proving to be a thorn in the side for the Spanish Empire especially, seen with the English officer and explorer Sir Francis Drake, famous for circumnavigating the globe and discovering the Drake Passage. Drake was a bane to the Spanish Empire, pirating Spanish ships and plundering settlements in the Caribbean for years, making him a national hero in his home country of England. And Drake even personally visited and treated with several maroon leaders in Central America in order to unilaterally combat the Spanish before dying of dysentery in Panama in 1596. In Jamaica, a large proportion of the interior was populated by Maroons, threatening the ever-growing population of black slaves and plantations all throughout the island, and a large group of Maroons and recently escaped slaves rebelled against the colonial authority, eventually being defeated, with a large number deported from Jamaica either to the British colony of Sierra Leone or all the way to Canada, where they helped form the Black Nova Scotian community. And although they never made up a particularly high percentage of the province's population in its history, peaking around 3%, it is the oldest African-descended population in the northeast of the North American continent, and they were, up until the 1960s, virtually the only major black population in Canada. The Windward Maroons, who remained neutral during the war, still do exist, however, living quite simple lifestyles with a culture very reminiscent of the African nations they derive from. However, by and large, the most noteworthy Maroon community today are the Guyanese Maroons in the territory of the Guyanas, namely the former British and Dutch territories of Guyana and Suriname, and the current French territory of Guyana. Early in the history of the Guyanas, the Dutch owned virtually all of this territory, although nearly all settlements were on the coast, with large plantations owned by Dutch and a few Portuguese planters, and when African slaves escaped, they trekked for miles deep into the Amazon rainforest, and although some attempted to return to Africa, for the most part, they accepted their fates and created secret villages loosely connected to one another, splintering into roughly 6 tribes over the centuries, with the Saramacan and Nduka being the largest. Now, unlike other Maroon groups, the Maroons of the Guyanas were never recaptured, conquered, or forced back into the general society, and the Dutch, realizing it wasn't exactly feasible or cost-efficient to launch a full-scale sweep through tens of thousands of miles of jungles, decided to treat with the Maroons, eventually reincorporating them into what would later become Suriname and French Guiana. These were villages of near full-blooded Africans transplanted to the continents of the Americas, and their culture and societies were very similar to that of Africa, having a comparable climate and landscape in the Caribbean region as West Central Africa, and they even adopted a unique script known as Afaka for transcribing their languages, Creole languages with extremely strong African influence. Numbering in the hundreds of thousands in the Guyanas today, around 20% in Suriname, and 10% in French Guiana, Maroons have always considered themselves to be very ethnically and culturally distinct from others in the region, as unlike in the United States, there was no binary racial classification. Although due to recent missionary work, the majority of the community has adopted Christianity and is becoming increasingly integrated into these societies, rather than being the de facto autonomous nation that they had always been. There are many other fascinating tales of the Maroons such as this, and I hope you learned something new from today's video. Be sure to let me know your thoughts on the Maroons and other free black.
He needs to get some voice training. So Maroons still exist, particularly in Jamaica.
Picky boy.
Right now we are in the John Crow Hills, deep in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica, and things are about to get super interesting.
We're here at the Scots Hall Maroon Town, and the Maroons were originally escaped slaves who carved out autonomous regions within the hills of Jamaica. We're meeting up with Colonel Pink, who's the leader of this community. He's going to share more about Maroon culture and what makes them unique in Jamaica.
The Maroons are descended from West African slaves brought to Jamaica by the Spanish. They escaped slavery and fled to the mountains to live off the land with the Taino Indians.
But their numbers surged in 1655. When the British invaded Jamaica, the Spanish abandoned their plantations and more slaves escaped to join the Maroons in Jamaica's isolated Central Mountains.
When the British tried to take control, the Maroons fought 2 guerrilla wars, eventually forcing the British to recognize their autonomy and establish their freedom in the late 1700s, more than 50 years before the British abolished the slave trade and over 200 years before Jamaica's independence.
So the British didn't abolish the slave trade in this instance. Africans did. But that's what a lot of people don't understand. Like, we liberated ourselves. Like, if you did not basically recognize us as free people, we would just fucking, okay, we're going to the mountains. So we abolished the slave trade. The British didn't do shit.
I am Colonel Rudolph Pink, and you're in Scots Hall, Maroon Town.
My name is Rodine Rose, right? I am one of the captain of the Scots Hall Maroon Town.
My name is Gart Matux, and I'm one of the captain and dancer.
My name is Kishana Robinson, and I am one of the drummer. Thank you.
My name is Marco, and I'm one of the Vaga brothers. And this is
And I'm Alex, and I'm also one of the Vaga brothers.
All right, nice to meet you guys. Nice to meet you guys.
Just to explain some more about a Maroon Town, right? Remember, back in the day, most of our foreparents were enslaved by the Spanish. You know, we come from Africa, so we know much about the bush and about guerrilla warfare. We are the only people that forced the English to come and sign a treaty with us. We were the first independent people of Jamaica. We the Maroon.
Is that a warning to the farmer up there saying it's you guys, it's okay?
Well, it's just signal that, well, there's no harm.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no harm.
Oh, wow.
No threat.
So when we were coming up the valley, you guys were blowing that.
Oh, yeah, to clear the road, make sure we keep all the way clear. In signal the community that there's visitors in the community, and, you know, they don't need to be worried about nothing at all. Everything is all cool.
That's so cool.
You get a very diplomatic escort by the Maroons, Maroon warriors.
Yeah, that's so cool.
It's just a really fascinating story, you know? This culture has been here for hundreds of years. The first freed people here in Jamaica, and they did it through perseverance and willpower.
So Colonel Pink and the captain just explained to us that this village is now turning itself into a tourist destination with a bed and breakfast and cultural experiences open
That explains why you were allowed in and you didn't get beheaded with a machete.
to visitors.
Alright, so we're in the back of this flatbed truck going down this dirt road, heading down to the river. It's pretty awesome. The entire group is here with their drums, with their horns, making a racket. This is wild right now. Like, honestly, I had no idea we'd be doing this, but I'm so happy that we did.
I have to say, as a traveler, it's such a privilege to be able to see this, to be able to partake in this. And you can see from these mountains here that this is really rugged terrain. If you can't tell, we are bouncing around. And it's this impassable terrain that first allowed the Maroons to escape here from British rule, and then has since allowed them to preserve their culture.
So one of the squatters just climbed the fruit tree. He's like 20 feet in the air, and he's just chucking ripe apples down. As you can see, very nice, very nice.
It's not easy to get in, it's not easy to get out, but we're finding that if you make it here, it's very much worth the trip.
Someone moving in a new direction.
Yeah, they're just going through the village and showing how they live. But military aspect is extremely amazing. And like that's why like I always laugh when people say, "Oh, you can't wage protracted people's war against a stronger imperialist power." Like these people show that actually you can. So we already met this guy Dan Sayers. And this is just talking about like what he did in the swamp. Very, very deadly terrain if you don't know where you're going and what you're doing, and you don't know how to live there. The Great Dismal Swamp, now reduced by draining and development, is managed as the Federal Wildlife Reserve. The once notorious panthers are gone, but bears, birds, deer, and amphibians are still abundant, so are venomous snakes and biting insects. In the awful heat and humidity of summer, Sayers assures me, the swamp teems with water moccasins and rattlesnakes. The mosquitoes get so thick that they can blur the outlines of a person standing 12 feet away. So, yeah, if you're a white person from Northern Europe, you're probably not going to enjoy life here very much. And you shouldn't, because this is a refuge for our people who are fleeing your slavery. No archaeology has been done in the swamp's interior prior to 2004 because the conditions are so challenging. One research party got lost so many times that they gave it up. So Sayers. Yeah, Dwayne the Swamp is a pretty racist thing. They view Washington as a swamp. I mean, it is of a different type than they think. The guy Sayers, he's actually he's a Marxist. He's a Marxist and a vegan who smokes nearly 2 packs a day and keeps himself revved up on Monster energy drinks until it's time to crack a beer. Yeah, sounds like somebody I know. So, marronage, the process of extricating oneself from slavery, took place all over Latin America and the Caribbean, the slave islands of the Indian Ocean, Angola, and other parts of Africa. But until recently, the idea that Maroons had also existed in North America had been rejected by most historians. Most people thought it was crazy. Most people thought that the only way to free yourself from slavery in the United States was to go to Canada. That's what we were talking about, the Underground Railroad, etc. So how was the swamp back in the day before they started draining it? Alexander Spotswood, the colonial lieutenant governor of Virginia, described the swamp as no man's land to which loose and disorderly people daily flock. Since Africans and African Americans were not referred to as people in the records of 18th century Virginia, this suggests that poor whites were also joining the swamp communities. So this is the area that before they started draining it, this is the area that the swamp encompassed. It's right outside of Norfolk, Virginia, and Virginia Beach, and Portsmouth, and all these other cities. You go a little bit further north, you'll hit Washington D.C. So it straddles Virginia and North Carolina, and these were the indigenous nations of the area. You got Pasquotank, Perkamans, Curatek, etc. So pretty neat. Picture the swamp. Yeah, not a good place to walk around in if you're a slave catcher with dogs. But basically just covered the stuff he talked about in the video. Everything he's found to fit into a single shoebox, he says. And swamps decompose shit. That's why people put bodies in them. Because if you throw something into a swamp, it's going to break apart. So the cabins and stuff, like there's still remnants of those. But most of the stuff that they found is clay, burnt clay, tobacco pipe fragments, 5mm piece of shot, quartz flake, a British gunflint chip, a shard of glass, a nail head with a partial stem. So, yeah, not that much there, but it's enough to show that people were there. A historical marker indicates where slaves dug a large ditch for George Washington to assist with draining the swamp and logging. Washington Ditch, they call it. So, yeah, I've talked a bit about Maroons and how people resisted both on and off plantations and how they played rival imperial powers off each other. But, like, why is Ron DeSantis trying to bury this history? And where did the idea that this history must be buried come from in the first place? The answer is something called the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause of the Confederacy, or simply Lost Cause, is an American pseudo-historical negationist myth that claims that the Confederate States' cause during the Civil War was just heroic and not centered on slavery. So this is not the full extent of what DeSantis is saying. DeSantis is just focusing on one tiny piece of this myth, but it can expand and blow up, okay? This is the South. So, what is the aspect that DeSantis is focusing on here? Let's see. I just had it. I'm like the crazy librarian throwing books around. You see the Confederate flags and shit. This is the flag, was the flag of Georgia. This is the flag of Mississippi. So tenets of the Lost Cause movement include that slavery was not only a benign institution, but a positive good. It was not based on economic greed, and slaves were generally happy and loyal to their kind masters. Slavery was good for blacks and whites alike, a symbiosis of races which were inherently unequal by nature. The lives of enslaved blacks were much better than they would be in America, in Africa, or as free blacks in the North, where there were numerous anti-black riots. Blacks were perceived as foreigners, immigrants taking away jobs from whites by working for less, and also as dangerously sexual. It was not characterized by racism, rape, harsh working conditions, brutality, forced separation of families, and humiliation. So, yeah, that's a lie. But that's Ron DeSantis' lie. And this is one thing that they seize on. Hayward Shepherd was actually accidentally killed by John Brown. Well, John Brown's men during the raid on Harper's Ferry. If I recall correctly, he was a railroad worker. He worked on the railroad. According to one source, he was born free, but another source says he had been the property of station master Fontaine Beckham. He was over 6 feet tall and lived in Winchester, Virginia. He was a baggage handler. So what happened? He had been out on the railroad bridge looking for a watchman who was missing, and he had been ordered to halt by some men who were there. And instead of doing that, he turned around, and as he turned, they shot him in the back. He rejected his assaulters' claim that this was to begin a slave rebellion. He thought that they were robbers. So, yeah, kind of a big tactical error that your rebellion that is supposed to free slaves kills a black guy as its first act. So, more about the lost cause. Slavery is portrayed as a positive good. Submissive, happy, and faithful slaves were better off in the system of chattel slavery, which offered them protection. Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens declared in 1861, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition." After the war, these formerly enslaved people were now said to be unprepared for freedom, which was an argument against Reconstruction and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. So that's what DeSantis is ideologically underpinning himself with. That is the company that he's keeping. That is how he's a fascist. He's not going to teach about John Horse, the Seminole and Black Alliance, the Maroons, and all of these other things, most of which took place in his state, because to do so, he feels would give ideological clout to what he sees as the woke left. So teaching actual real history that we've just covered is dangerous to fascists like DeSantis, who rely on a mythologized version of history. He relies on the notion, or he's trying to promote and push the notion to Floridian students in K through 12 that slavery had benefits. We've just found out how slavery doesn't have any benefits. Slavery was fucking horrible. It's had long-standing psychological and physical impacts on black people all over the Americas and black people in the continent. Slavery was devastating. It was a world historically horrible event. So DeSantis, I think, knows what he's doing. He's a fascist. And like all fascists, he realized that culture and education is a trench of combat. It's a battlefield. It's up to leftists to also realize this. Am I telling you to go become a teacher? If you want to. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. I will see you tomorrow. What am I going to be talking about?